As you can imagine, it is not uncommon to pick up injuries whilst training for combat sports, and to be honest, sports in general. But I'd sooner rather have some injuries from sport than kind of some of these chronic symptoms you can pick up from sitting around. Fortunately, there are some things you can do to decrease your injury risk and keep yourself healthy and in the gym training, and also being healthy for when you get into the ring or cage or on the mat for your competition as well. So here are my 5 biggest mistakes. The first mistake that I see is sparring too hard. Now, sparring is definitely an important aspect of combat sports training. It is essentially the sport aspect of the training. And whilst you may see some pros, some experienced pros, very experienced pros, opt to steer clear of sparring, sometimes almost completely in some instances. For most of us, if we're training combat sports, it's vital for our sporting development, because it would be a bit like, doing, just training for running by doing running drills. You actually have to do the sport itself. So if you're just doing hitting pads and hitting the bag, chances are you're not doing a combat sport, you're just hitting the bag and doing pad work. So you have to actually do the sport in order to develop your skills and your reactions and all that type of stuff. But that being said, there are definitely productive ways to spar and some not so productive ways to spar. Now, having a war every session, albeit fun, we all like to have a war from time to time. It's probably one of the reasons why we get into combat sports in the first place. But it's often, if you're going to do that every time you spar, it's going to slow your progress, and it's probably going to leave you with a headache. And it's not ideal for your long-term progress, certainly. So whilst there's definitely a place for hard sparring, especially in the build-up to fights, maybe having, instead of hard sparring all the time, maybe going into a sparring session where you're controlling your load and the forces that you put on your sparring partners, and having a goal from the sparring session, like maybe today I'm going to work on a certain defense, like I'm going to slip the jab here, or today I'm going to work on parrying a shot, or today I'm going to work on a certain combination, and trying to drill those combinations or those techniques that you've been learning in your drills and putting them into a real life situation. Maybe that's a more beneficial way to spar. But make sure you kind of communicate this with your training partner, because the last thing you want to do is, because when you are trying to practice certain techniques in sparring, which I'd advise you do, you may take a shot from time to time, because you're not always going to get it right. You're trying to adapt your technique and style to introduce new stuff. So communicate with a training partner to make sure the intensity enables you to make mistakes. So that if you take a shot, you just take a little shot and it's not harmful. You don't end up on the mat seeing stars. Mistake number 2, oversized training partners. Combat sports specifically are weight class sports. And for that reason, there's very little, need to wrestle with a gorilla when you're going to be fighting a dwarf monkey. I had to look up what a dwarf monkey was, by the way. But the truth is, bigger people are typically stronger than smaller people, and they can tolerate bigger forces and have other attributes like height and reach, which can act in their advantage. So when you're sparring with these bigger people, those advantages can add up and we can get hurt. And whilst it may be great to fluff your ego from time to time, beating a bigger person in sparring, I would advise that you try to stick with training partners for the majority of the time who are 1 to 2 weight classes within your weight class, which means you're going to be minimizing the risk of injury through training, but also you're going to be competing and sparring with people that are going to be a similar size to you and more mimic the types of people that you're going to meet in competition. The third biggest mistake is having no plan with your training. What I'd advise is try to build a plan, or have some sort of rough idea in your head as what you're trying to achieve from maybe the week or the training session that you're going to. I would advise probably having heavier days where you have more high intensity stuff, and maybe lower intensity days where you do some, it's more technique based to give your body that rest in between higher and lower intensity. There's really no point, certainly from a performance standpoint or an injury prevention standpoint, from going hard or trying to go hard all the time, because you won't be going hard all the time. Because if you're going hard all the time, you'll be working at 60 to 70% intensity rather than full intensity, because you'll be fatigued, or doing mindless amounts of volume, because these are factors that do contribute to injury. So build up your training volume and intensity over time, over years, as you progress with your training. And certainly if you are newer to the sport, time on the mat can be of real great value. So you want to make this time quality time, and if you're really trying to learn the sport, maybe you want to make that slightly lower intensity so you can spend more time on the mat doing your skill-based work in order to progress to the kind of higher intensity stuff like sparring and the real high intensity work later on. Mistake number 4 is having no focus on recovery. And there's 2 things here that are pretty important and are the low-hanging fruits, and they're sleep and nutrition. And they really are keys to recovery. So spend some time getting educated on how much sleep you need and how much fuel you need to sustain your training. And there's ample info on the internet that you can dig into for this, but let's try not to get bogged down with it too much. We have some very simple recommendations because simplicity is definitely best. We recommend over 7 hours sleep a night. If you look at the research on that, and certainly working with athletes, you do see a significant increase in injury risk and low, tolerance to pain when you have less than 7 hours sleep a night. So that's kind of a very simple thing to tick off. But athletes training particularly hard or for particularly long durations may really want to increase that sleep, because that's a real good recovery optimization strategy. The second thing around nutrition, now we want to aim for matched calories, if you're training for prolonged periods, and we want to have a moderate to high protein intake. Depending on your weight, this is going to vary, and we don't want to exclude things from our diet. We don't want to take out fats or carbohydrates. We want to make sure we eat we get all of our micronutrition and macronutrient needs, because essentially our body needs all of those for fuel and to function well. So there's some things to consider in that area. If you're struggling with nutritional needs or kind of sleep or something like that, speak to a coach and they'll be able to advise you on that. Number 5, and probably this is definitely a huge mistake we see across all sports, but certainly in combat sports, is that not having any resistance training programming or any resistance training at all in your training. Now, we know that resistance training is a great way to build up tolerance to load in tissues, make them stronger, decrease injury risk, but also we know that translates to increased power, strength, speed, all the stuff that's very, very important for performance. So adding resistance training into your workouts is beneficial on all levels. We can agree on that. Now, this is probably going to look different depending on your training age and your training goals, but something is certainly better than nothing. That being said, probably when you're kind of in the earlier stages of your combat sports journey and you're learning, you may not want to sacrifice too many technique sessions in order to add in resistance training sessions. Now, the key focus in these early stages probably will be the sport specific stuff. Now, there's no point having super strong legs if you've got no head movement. After all, you're doing a sport where you're trying to avoid punches to the head. We'll catch you very soon on the channel.